From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Ahead today, K-State's Monte Vandeveer will talk about determining an economic value of freeze-damaged wheat that's to be salvaged as forage. He'll go over the formula for comparing wheat silage or wheat hay to conventional forage types. Also today, K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti on the implications of cold temperature injury to newly planted corn following the recent cold weather. He'll go over the signs of chilling injury to corn that you producers should be scouting for in the days ahead. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Judy O'Mara on cedar rust disease and how it can adversely afflict landscape trees other than cedars. All that coming up on Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Thanks for tuning in. This is the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Well, there have been questions and even doubts about the state of winter wheat numerous parts of Kansas because of those April freezes and other complications that have many a producer looking at those wheat stands and wondering if they're more valuable if salvaged for forage. We're going to speak to that today, putting a value on that wheat as a forage. Joining us once more, Monte Vandeveer. Monte, as you know, is a research and extension agricultural economist for K-State, based in southwest Kansas. There are some prerequisites producers need to go through before they make a move whatsoever on utilizing that wheat other than as grain.
Right. Got to be sure, before you grease up the baler and swather and charge out there to the field, we need to talk to our crop insurance agents and if that crop is insured. And, of course, one of the issues from the crop insurance side is trying to determine what the value of the crop would be if it was kept for grain. So part of that puzzle, sometimes that means leaving a strip of crop to see what the grain yield actually would be. I think it's also, a lot of adjusters like to wait a few days or several days before they go back and reinspect the field and get a better idea of just what damage is done. So that's hopefully something most of our producers have already been attending to. And make sure you get everything straight with your crop insurance agent before you head out to the field.
So, Monte, how to assign an economic value to wheat? And we're looking at two harvesting options here, silage and hay. How does one get at this?
Well, the way we've shown in this article is just very simple. We're trying to compare the feed value of that wheat silage or that wheat hay to another forage where we do have a pretty good handle on the market prices. So to the extent that they are comparable or similar in feed value, then we try to draw a comparison that way. So that was our very simple approach. At least it gives us kind of an upper bound and a lower bound on what prices buyers and sellers might be looking at.
So let's take up wheat silage as the alternative here, first off. And what you're comparing it to, well, alfalfa hay, right?
Yeah, alfalfa hay is probably the best forage in terms of having prices widely available all across the state. And so that's kind of our starting point. And it's not a bad comparison for the wheat silage. Of course, you're going to have to check with your agronomy and nutrition folks and see what stage the wheat is at as you make that silage decision there. But what we've done is assuming we're making silage out of hay that's at an early head stage. And what we do is we come up with the value of the silage on an energy basis and on a crude protein basis, and then see how that compares back with the alfalfa hay. And it's just a tweak up or a tweak down. With the silage, the energy side for wheat silage is just a bit better than our good quality alfalfa hay. So if you're pricing it that way, it would come in just a slightly higher price than the alfalfa hay. We're adjusting for moisture content, so make sure we get that in there. But on a dry matter basis, our wheat silage comes in with about 73% TDN compared to, say, 58 to 60% TDN on our alfalfa hay. So our using one of the recent market prices for our good quality alfalfa hay in Kansas, it's in the neighborhood of $150 to $170 a ton. So if you priced it just on a TDN basis, on an energy basis, you'd get a price that was at or higher than what the alfalfa hay was showing. Flip side, though, is the crude protein in your wheat silage is going to be a bit lower than you would on the alfalfa hay. So that gives us kind of the boundary. And using, say, $160 a ton for that alfalfa hay price, you'd get a range of anywhere from about $70 a ton to about $50 a ton on your wheat silage. Now, remember, that's for the wet stuff. That at least it gives us a starting point from where producers can go.
And you've made a similar comparison in this analysis, Monte, with alfalfa hay if that wheat is harvested as hay. How does that break out?
Yeah, we do the same kind of thing, pricing wheat hay in terms of alfalfa hay on an energy basis and on a crude protein basis. On an energy basis, wheat hay is pretty close to alfalfa hay. But on the protein side, the wheat hay tends to come in quite a bit lower. So we get a bigger range in that case. So that $160 alfalfa hay, $160 per ton, if we priced it on the energy side, we'd come out almost as much as the alfalfa hay. I came up with about $155 a ton. But if you price it using the crude protein value, it's quite a bit less. Less than half the value there. So that ends up being quite a big range. And so another alternative is to look at a different feed stuff that maybe has a little bit closer feed value.
And you would trot out for that purpose forage sorghum for comparison, then you say.
Right. That's where we ended up. We had a lot better comparison in terms of both energy and crude protein value, comparing that to forage sorghum hay values. And so if you had a sorghum hay value of $110 a ton, you'd get a wheat hay price pretty close to that, maybe $110 to $120 per ton. It's pretty close in feed value to what we're seeing for that sorghum hay. And that's almost half in the midpoint of that price range we got on using the alfalfa hay too. So hopefully that's a meaningful number, and at least it's a starting point.
Now, Monte, you've provided these good examples, but they're just that, examples. You want producers to understand that they need to work their own numbers up that represent their own wheat and their own alfalfa or other forage markets in their locale, right?
Right. The whole exercise is just trying to demonstrate a method for saying, okay, here's one forage where we do have a pretty good idea of the price, and how can we come up with a value for this other one? And so I had to make up some numbers to illustrate the example, and hopefully that's meaningful for a starting point. But everybody's going to have to plug in their own numbers, and the numbers in the article aren't the official sort of K-State price quotes that everybody needs to follow. So just make sure we're gives you a starting point and something to think about.
Local markets may ebb and flow apart from these numbers some. So producers need to study this not only with the notion of these representative examples that you have put together, but exactly what is going on in their locale, what that might mean to the value of that wheat forage then.
Right. And if hauling distance is a factor, then that needs to be taken into account too. The prices we quote are usually edge of the field prices, and so If we have to go very far, then some adjustment that way too.
Well, what you just walked through, Monte, is included in an Agronomy e-update article posted this past Friday on pricing wheat silage and wheat hay. You can take a look at that, producers. And before we let you go, Monte, to come back to that wheat crop that's being salvaged other than for grain, if one is going to then follow that wheat with a second crop, reverting to the insurance side once again, there are things that producer needs to take care of and be aware of as they make that decision on recropping that acreage.
Right. If you're thinking about getting whatever forage you can from that wheat crop that's had some problems, and you think, well, maybe I can go back to a second crop this summer. I think a lot of producers in Kansas maybe look at going back to maybe a grain sorghum crop that they could plant maybe sometime in June. Have to pay attention to the insurance details on that. In Kansas, we really don't have many places where you can insure a second crop. They have a lot of restrictions against the double cropping. So if you do want to go that way, that second crop is not going to be insured if you maintain the insurance on the first crop, on your wheat crop. So there's a lot of details to look at and check with your crop insurance agent. The article you mentioned, it has a link to Ag Manager story we did a couple years ago. Remember, we had that late, wet, heavy snow at the end of April a couple years ago. And so we kind of outlined those crop insurance details there and a little more carefully. And so there's a link in this article to that one. And hopefully you can read up and have your questions ready when you go see your crop insurance agent.
But, of course, be sure to strike up that conversation before you act in any way, shape, or form on your wheat crop utilized as something other than for grain. Again, have a look at the article at agronomy.ksu.edu in the e-update series dated this past Friday, May the 8th. And as always, Monte, we appreciate the input. Many thanks to you.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it.
That from Monte Vandeveer, K-State Research and Extension, an agricultural economist for the university based in southwest Kansas. And you're listening to Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Keeping your distance from others is important in slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are some fun things to do alone. Read a book, take a walk, unpack your suitcase from that trip you took last September, paint a self-portrait, catch up on a TV series, do a puzzle. Remember, we should all stay home to lower the risk for everyone. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today as we further troubleshoot the newly planted row crops in Kansas and more directly here, what's happening with corn in those areas which have been saddled with cold temperatures for several days in the last couple of weeks or so. Ignacio Ciampitti joins us via phone now. Ignacio is a crop production and cropping systems specialist, K-State Research and Extension. And what we'll get into today, Ignacio, the chances of cold injury to newly planted corn, that seed that's still in the ground and yet to germinate or just having freshly germinated. Again, we've had uncommonly cool temperatures for this time of the year of late, which have prompted questions about what's happening with that newly seeded corn.
Yeah, Eric, thanks for the invitation. I think that one of the cause of concern, for many farmers, I think that if we look at the conditions that we just went through the last couple of days, is connected to the temperature. So, and we released some information last Friday in our e-update, the Department of Agronomy. So we have some information showing the status of the soil temperature across different sections of the state. And then the challenge is specifically for those that they were kind of a recently planted corn, that corn that was just planted last week, Wednesday, Thursday. And to be honest, the main challenges were more faced on the northwest and north central section of the state, where we can see that in some of those environments, our soil temperatures were around 60s last week, and in some places even below 60. And then our main concern was that by looking at the temperatures that we received Saturday morning, Sunday morning, and then the last ones on Monday morning, where projections of temperatures really close to 36 Fahrenheit in some places. One of our major concern was how low the soil temperature will drop. Mm-hmm. And of course, the drop on soil temperature will depend on multiple factors. We mentioned some of these in a previous time, but I mean, we need to think about residue cover. If we have more residue that act as an insulation, so then moisture status. So if you have a higher moisture level, that was not the case in Northwest in many fields, the soil moisture can also act as an insulation or at least buffer the changes on temperature. Lower positions in the field more affected than upper level positions. So the main challenge, I would say, for corn is what we call, and similar on soybeans, is the issue of the chilling injuries, when temperatures will be below 50 degrees.
And what sort of injury will those cold soil temperatures inflict on the corn seed itself then?
Well, everything that happens for corn that when planted 24, 72 hours, so we're talking about 1, 2, 3 days, okay, after planting, is the moment that those seeds will start imbibing water and begin the germination process. So those kernels will start taking water, and if the cell tissues of the kernels are too cold, I mean, when that water is coming is too cold, they become less elastic and they start basically rupturing the entire seed. And these are some of the symptoms, I mean, that in fact what happens is they fail to germinate. And at some point, even if they germinate, you will see issues connected to the radicle or the coleoptile. You will see malformations potentially. And then usually to look at the impacts that we have seen on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday on this last week, I would say wait 3-4 days, and then we'll start making an assessment from that recently planted corn, digging for seeds and trying to see exactly if there was any potential impacts. Most of the places I would expect impacts is more north central or northwest parts of the state where temperatures really dropped, and more in the scenarios that we have soils that were more susceptible with less residue cover and less soil moisture. And then for some of the corn that was just, or soybean that were just above the ground, we also are seeing some potential effects. One of the, we always call more cosmetic effect on corn because usually the growing point is below the ground, so we are safe. But what you will tend to see, if the plant got affected, you will tend to see that kind of a leaf burn. And the leaves, even if they are the first or second leaves, I mean, they are completely burned. I don't think that is an extremely issue in the case of corn because, again, growing point is below the ground. On soybean, it's a big concern because those plants are depending on the cotyledons, and they depend on those cotyledons for the first couple of days. So if those cotyledons are basically damaged, that plant survival can be compromised. And that's one of the main challenges, potentially more for soybeans when they're up than corn. It's a cause of concern more specifically when the plant is recently planted.
Will we see adverse effects beyond the leaf burn that you just mentioned there? You noted in that article in the E-Update on this topic the possibility of deformed corn plants upon germination.
Yeah, we will potentially might see, for example, what we call the cork screwing, the formation of the elongation of the mesocotyl. And then we will also might potentially see complete failure on emergence, in some situations. So I think that we can visually start seeing today, after 3 or 4 days, potential impact from the Saturday freeze. And then you will get to see if those plants and how those plants are doing right now. For the ones that the farmers that were planted last week, and specifically on north central, northwest area, for those farmers, I would say that they will need to wait probably at least 2 or 3 more days just to make a good assessment on how things going. And I think that the main concern there is when soil temperature went below 50 degrees, because that is when we will see that chilling injury during the germination time.
And not to add insult to injury here, but corn seeds that have been weakened by this chilling may, you say, also be more prone to diseases or even herbicide injury when that time comes.
Yeah. In fact, anything that is affected by chill, is more affected specifically also by sensitivity to herbicides, which could be a big factor, no? and also by seedling blights. I mean, I'm not too concerned on the disease side because soil temperatures will go back up probably, hopefully, in the next coming days. The only challenge will be more that we might get into the wet pattern, and we might start seeing some fields that they will be more saturated. Probably that will be kind of a perfect storm of seeing plants that they are a little bit damaged, plus these saturated conditions coming with more rain, which for some areas of the state we really need it, but in some places we are in a good shape. And I think that will be kind of the perfect storm of the plant already susceptible because of the chilling, and then having another type of stress coming on continuous rain, saturated soil conditions, which could promote maybe more potential problems for early season disease there for those small plants.
So then, Ignacio, for a producer who, upon scouting their fields, discovers indications of chilling injury to that corn seed, they have a difficult decision to make potentially about replanting that crop or planting to another crop if that damage is serious enough.
Yeah. I mean, and that's one of the things we really need to still wait to make sure that we have a good assessment on that, because we will not take very lightly any decision on replanting. But we really need to start, I mean, for some of the guys, when we start looking at maybe next week, if we are seeing 7 to 10 days, I mean, and really poor emergence, I think that we need to start considering options, and then based on the number of plants that we can, that we target and we are achieving, start thinking about if we are below, even in some cases 60, 70% below, or even 50, then replanting, and when there are big areas, could be something that we can start thinking about.
Right. By the way, there is a fine article complete with picture illustrations of what Ignacio is talking about here, chilling injury to corn seeds, in the E-Update newsletter from this past Friday on soil temperatures and cold injury for corn. By title, that article, you can find it at agronomy.ksu.edu. And in general, Ignacio, no spring planting season is without complications, so corn may be having some issues here and there. We still have a ways to go before we can make the call on soybeans and then later grain sorghum, but things are shaping up to be challenging in a basic sense, aren't they?
Yeah. I hope that the temperatures were not that severe, and I hope that we can see maybe not as large effects as we are already seeing in some of the northern states, that some of the farmers or some of the people contacts, start reporting quite a large issues, from last week temperatures. So I'm hoping that we were a little bit more on the safe side. So, but any replanting decision this year is for sure not taking it very, very lightly. So scout your fields, and then I think that there is always opportunities to think on the go and trying to use the best judgment on this.
Good advice right there. Thanks for the word and the observations on what's happening out there in Kansas, and we appreciate it as always. We'll talk again soon, Ignacio.
Thank you very much.
Ignacio Ciampitti with us on Agriculture Today, crop production and cropping systems specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And we'll return with more for you after these moments away. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here as we move on now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, the nation's largest cattle producers organization and the National Lobbying Organization for Meat Packers are pushing back on legislation introduced in the U.S. Senate to mandate higher negotiated cash trade in the cattle industry. Senators Chuck Grassley of Iowa and John Tester of Montana, along with 3 other senators, introduced a bill on Tuesday that would require large meat packers to buy at least 50% of their weekly cattle purchases through the cash market. The senators pointed to market concentration among major packers and the spread between low cattle prices and high retail beef prices. The North American Meat Institute responded yesterday to questions by DTN, stating that the COVID-19 pandemic, quoting here, has created great market uncertainty and caused unanticipated slaughter disruptions that have hit beef producers especially hard. Still, that institute said that numerous studies, including one commissioned by the USDA, show marketing agreements between packers and cattle producers help provide consumers with affordable, reliable, and consistent meat products to the benefit of livestock producers and packers. Again, those are the words of the Institute, which went on to say an action by government forcing packers to buy half of their cattle on the spot market would distort the market and cause further upheaval to the food supply chain during these unprecedented times. Now, the USDA is currently investigating drastic price spreads between live cattle and boxed beef prices, going back to that fire last summer at the Tyson plant at Holcomb, Kansas, as well as the current price spread with the COVID-19 pandemic. Numerous state and federal legislators, that is, have also called on the Department of Justice to investigate the cattle markets as well. Now, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association issued a statement from South Dakota rancher Todd Wilkinson, who's the chairman of the NCBA's policy division. While the association has noted the need for more equitable markets for cattle producers, the group is opposed to mandating that packers rely more heavily on the cash market trade. Wilkinson said any solution must not restrict an individual producer's freedom to pursue marketing avenues that they determine best suit their business's unique needs. His words, government mandates like that being proposed by Senator Grassley would arbitrarily force many cattle producers to change the way they do business. Several agricultural groups praised the inclusion of provisions for biofuels, pork producers, and food aid in that $3 trillion COVID-19 legislation unveiled by House Democrats. The House could vote on that bill as early as tomorrow, by the way. House Democrat leaders recognize their legislation has little chance in the Senate. It does, though, provide a marker to set for negotiations with the Senate and the White House. The biofuels provision would authorize the USDA to provide 45 cents per gallon of ethanol produced from January 1 through May 1 of this year. Producers forced offline for one or more calendar months would qualify for that credit based on half the volume produced during the corresponding month or in months in 2019. And the National Pork Producers Council noted that bill would expand direct payments to livestock producers who have suffered severe losses as the COVID-related market disruptions have caused the value of their livestock to plummet and have forced herd liquidations. China has been buying U.S. soybeans recently, but one analyst says those purchases are likely to ramp up considerably this fall. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Analysts say that right now and throughout the next year, China will be gradually recovering from having its hog herd decimated by African swine fever.
So we expect some significant growth in their import demand and their consumption of protein.
USDA analyst Keith Menzies says that should eventually translate into even more soybean imports by China during this next year.
What we're expecting after seeing the enormous shipping of beans out of South America, especially Brazil, with a record 16 million plus ton export month in April, with about 10 or 11 of those going to China, they will be depleted by fall, and we expect a pretty sharp ramp up on U.S. exports to China.
So we should do pretty well in China until next spring when Brazil harvests its soybean crop.
So again, we'll be up against some competition this time next year.
This is Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And that takes us to this week's Kansas Soybean Update and an encore appearance by an earlier guest. Here's Greg Akagi.
Ignacio Ciampitti, Associate Professor and Cropping Systems Specialist at Kansas State University, joins us. And Ignacio, you've been conducting ongoing research looking at the potential impact of improving soybean yields by seed filling. What are some of the objectives of the research, and what have been some of your findings?
We are looking at different options, and we know that many farmers are usually focused on early season management, and usually they focus on practices that they will impact the crop early in the season. But we know that close to 50% of the yield is usually defined late in the season, and usually it's defined in the period that we call the seed filling for soybeans. So thinking on that situation, we know that protecting the canopy and the plant health at the end of the growing season is a key factor for soybeans. So we propose a project that we are looking at different management practices, looking at, for example, application of fungicide, insecticide, adding nutrients, and looking at different management so we can find ways of boosting up the yields and protecting the canopy. So far, what we are finding is that extending the duration of the greenness, the time where the plant still can be productive, is one of the key factors for securing, in some situations, between 3 to 4 bushels extra. And then that will be one of the best case scenarios in the sense of increasing yields. But we also are emphasizing the point that in many situations we are protecting yield.
Ignacio, this type of research is not possible without funding from the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Yes, the entire funding on this project was coming from Kansas Soybeans and Kansas Soybean Commission. And then the main point emphasized is that we are also looking at basically the frontier on the knowledge, because most of the research has been done in the past, was only focused on early season or practices that they were around mid-season. So we are really looking at trying to understand, can we impact yields or maintain yields by just adding extra management towards the end of the season, which is the moment that we know that we usually define really high proportion of the yields. Because seed weight is just one of the main factors and main component contributing to yield on soybeans.
Ignacio, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Greg.
Ignacio Ciampitti, Associate Professor and Cropping Systems Specialist at Kansas State University, has been our guest on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. Greg Akagi there. And we'll be back after this final break. You're tuned to Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, our horticultural segment for this week. We're going to fill you in on something that's often seen this time of the year in landscapes. And actually, there are 3 forms of this, which we'll get into in a moment. Cedar rust disease. We'll look at what it is, what it does, and what, if anything, you as a homeowner should do about it. We're joined once again by the director of the Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratory here at Kansas State University, Judy O'Mara. Cedar rusts, Judy, exactly what are they?
Well, they're very interesting. They're kind of visual, they're very cool, and we're at the time of year that they're very noticeable. After we have a rainy day in the spring during April and May, you may notice if you have a lot of cedars in the neighborhood in your landscape that you see these kind of bright orange, slimy swellings hanging from the tree, and they look like they have these finger-like tendrils that get longer and drippier and oozy. What this disease is it's a fungus, and it's a group of different fungi called cedar rust. There's 3 different kinds. The one that's most visual is called cedar apple rust. There's a second one called cedar hawthorn rust, and there's a third one called cedar quince rust. And so they're all active at the same time on cedar trees when it's really wet in the spring. The name implies that it occurs on 2 hosts, so cedar trees and a second host. So cedar apple rust, cedar hawthorn rust, cedar quince rust. What's really happening is the disease gets started on the cedar trees as those orange slimy globs, and then they produce fungal spores that are blowing around through the neighborhood, and they're landing on a second host, a susceptible variety of crabapples or hawthorns, or maybe ornamental pears. And then they infect that second host and produce a different type of symptom on that host.
And you might talk of those varying symptoms on those secondary hosts then. What folks might look for on those landscape trees.
Exactly. So on the second host, what you will notice is that the trees leaf out in the spring. They look great. and then you start to see orange spots on the leaves. So cedar apple rust will go to apple and crabapple, and they produce kind of pretty large orange spots on the leaves. Cedar hawthorn rust will go to cedar and then to hawthorns and actually ornamental pears, and they will also produce an orange spot on the leaves. And so you might be thinking, oh, no big deal, orange spots. But the secondary impact of the infection on the second host is that once the leaves become infected, they're prone to defoliating prematurely. So the disease will show up pretty much every year to some degree or another. It's more active in wet years than in dry years. But you can actually get quite a bit of defoliation. You might end up losing like 50 or 60% of the leaves. So the longer-term impact of that particular disease is not that it's going to kill the cedars, and it's not really going to kill the second alternate host, but when you lose your leaves on that second host, you weaken the tree because you really need a full set of foliage to have a nice, vigorous tree that builds up growth during the growing season and then puts reserves back down into the roots. So this can have kind of a low-level chronic effect over many years.
And it can be detrimental to the aesthetics of the tree.
Actually, that's a great point, because think about crabapples for a moment. They flower in the spring. They're brilliant. They're beautiful. You plant them. Everybody drives by your neighborhood. They say, oh, what a gorgeous tree. And then after the flowers go away and the plant leaves out, eventually as the leaves drop off, it becomes a tree that looks not quite so attractive. So an important impact is that the trees lose their beauty.
So, Judy, naturally then the homeowner wonders if there's some sort of preventative action or treatment action that they can take to keep these rust diseases from adversely affecting their landscape trees.
There is two approaches. One approach would be to come in preventively every year. If you have a susceptible crabapple or a susceptible hawthorn or ornamental pear, you can use fungicides. There's a wide range of products that are available. When you apply the products, you need to provide coverage pretty much throughout the months of April and May. So that's basically coming in every 7 to 10 days and applying it to the tree. And what you're really doing is you are protecting the tree from infection. When you use the products, you have to come back every year after year, to protect the tree. So it takes a lot of work to use fungicides. They're definitely available. You can go to most garden stores or go online and order products. But when you're using them, you're not really eradicating the problem. You're just protecting the tree in that current growing season. So that sort of leads you to the second management option.
And that is choosing a cultivar with resistance to cedar rust. And those cultivars are out there for the taking, you say?
They're out there. So we all love crabapples. They're great trees for the landscapes in Kansas. And so what's so timely about right now is we're seeing the galls active on the cedar trees, and people are working in their landscapes. They're thinking about adding some trees or shrubs to their landscapes, and so crabapples are a good choice. So my suggestion would be, if they are going to choose a crabapple, they should pick something that's resistant to cedar apple rust. So when they're picking out resistant varieties for cedar apple rust, if they're going to plant a flowering crabapple, interestingly enough, the cedar apple rust is not the only disease that it gets. It really gets several different important diseases. So when you're picking a variety, you really want to pick one that not only addresses the cedar apple rust, but also provides effective resistance to a disease called fire blight and a disease called apple scab. And if you just go to the publication Flowering Crabapples, it provides a rating guide for all three diseases.
And presumably there is resistance built into certain hawthorns and ornamental pears. Likewise, Judy?
Exactly. And we have that information available in our publications on the K-State website.
And so once again, homeowners, be aware of what can happen not only with cedars, but with these other secondary host trees, which can harbor the disease as well, and take the according action as need be. We appreciate you sharing all of this on Cedar Rusts. And Judy, we'll talk again soon. Many thanks to you.
You bet. Talk to you later, Eric.
She's the director of K-State's Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratory, Judy O'Mara. And that's this week's horticulture segment. As always, thanks for being along with us. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.